this was the response that we got. So about 65%, almost 3/4 of you are already going cover crops. So I'm probably preaching to the converted in some respects, but so that's really good, a really good starting point. And I suppose the question that I pose to you right at the very outset is, why are you choosing to put cover crops in your rotation? And perhaps those who are not going cover crops, why not? So, I mean, if you want to put list some various reasons in the chat, we can perhaps pick up on that a bit later on, and we can certainly capture that in our feedback to you at the end of the meeting. So if we click onto the next slide, Kate, this is my list as to why cover crops are grown. Right at the very outset, at the start of my sort of
various different things that
actually cover crops were very much in vogue from a water quality point of view, and they still are, with a lot of research going on looking at how they provide overwinter cover to minimise erosion and to control nitrate leaching losses.
Farmers are willing to grow might not
maintain that nitrogen and phosphorus within the system and improve soil fertility.
Has a place.
It's in terms of potentially improving soil structure, water holding and porosity, and that's been quite a more recent focus of research efforts, particularly trying to understand how different cover crops root and how that different rooting patterns then affect soil properties, but also what the impact of different types of organic matter going back into the soil are having on the overall soil fertility. But then there are other more practical reasons.
Neighbour was growing some stuff.
Control weeds, to disrupt pest and disease cycles, and then also to provide and habitat provision. So obviously there is the option to put that within a greening measurement and measure and get payment to do it. And then finally, and it's the one that we want to focus on really this evening, is the potential to provide additional grazing and forage production, perhaps when there isn't so much other forage around over the winter periods, and so thereby offer financial return. So if we click to the next slide, just to show some evidence as to where we're basing those reasons from, and this is some work that Kate has done with Anglian Water, and I think we've got someone from Anglian Water on the call tonight, so it's great. This is a lovely piece of work, clearly demonstrating how different cover crops affect nitrate leaching losses and how the percentage cover that you get in microbiology influence. So where we've got stubble with less than 5% cover, just hardly any weeds, cultivated stubble where weeds are growing back a little bit more, compared to radish with oats and a premium cover crop mix providing 80 or 90% cover, you can see the drop-off, significant drop-off in nitrate leaching losses as a result of that cover crop being in place. So if we click on to the next slide, so obviously having that protection there means that you're retaining nitrogen in your system. So this is another piece of work that we've done with Portsmouth Water this time. Similar sort of study. We actually, in this case, had an oat cover crop that didn't establish particularly well, only produced 30% cover, had the highest nitrate leaching losses compared to stubble, which was actually a really weedy stubble, 45% cover, compared to a facility providing decomposition rates, and see the drop off in nitrate leaching that's happened as a result of that cover crop. And then when we measured soil nitrogen in the spring and looked at what was retained in the cover crop, we can then come up with the soil nitrogen supply, the SNX, which is given in the table. And you can see that the Phacelia and the Phacelia oat cover crop basically retained 74 kilos of nitrogen within the system and pushed that SNS index up by 1. So that we could actually reduce the nitrogen fertilizer that we subsequently applied to this trial with no impact on the grain yields at the end of the day.
Combine, so that we
slide.
statistics,
and this is sort of
the ADAS economics,
the nitrogen supply, but looking at how cover crops can improve soil structure and
moment to be able to do the yield map
these are
analysis on 3 more
completed project that we did with AHDB called the Maxi Cover Crop Project. It's just recently been published online. And this was a trial we did with a farmer down in Kent. So a tramline trial where he established 2 different cover crop mixes. Mix 1 was just a very simple
and do it.
Mix 3 had 5 different
couple of ways we could do it, but really be a case of knowing, you know, who's got
the blue line is the control, no cover crop, and the red and the orange lines are where we had a cover crop. And you can see sort of between 10 and 20 centimetres depth, we've got a significant improvement in our penetration resistance. So it's much easier to
see the comment
in that.
Yeah. No, that's all right.
I think the right hand side, these are the earthworm counts we did actually a year after the cover crop had been in place. So this was in the winter crop, so in the spring of the winter crop, so a year afterwards. And you can see that with increasing complexity of the cover crop, so mix 3, that 5 species mix, compared to mix 1 and compared to the control, we have more earthworms as a whole. So encouraging biological activity. So clear evidence that not only do we save on our nitrogen, but we are also improving soil health as we go along. So if we click onto the next slide, Kate. So obviously, there's lots of benefits, but to be of benefit, we need to consider quite a few things. There's a whole load of different questions. The first one being, what cover crop should I grow? Should I grow a straight? Should I mix it up? And really, we need to think about what we want to achieve from that cover crop, because different cover crops will have different
but we need to be.
But also we need to think about what fits with the rotation and the cost of that cover crop mix. Then when we've decided what we want to do, we then need to think about how we're going to establish it and manage it going forward. And then how we're going to destroy it. And I've highlighted that in bold because that's something that we're going to be touching on and what we want to focus the field lab on, basically. But then not only, these all then have an implication for the next crop in the way that it establishes the quality of the seed bed, but also in the nutrition of that crop, how much we are looking, and the health of it. So if we click onto the next slide, Kate. So in terms of cover crop choice, there's actually quite a lot of really good information out there on different cover crop species and what they do. And we can broadly divide them into brassicas, cereals, legumes, and others. So I've just listed a few examples. So, for example, the brassicas, radish and mustard, these are particularly good at roots and taking up nutrients. Some of them are good as biofumigants. But obviously, you need to think about a potential conflict with oilseed rape in your rotation from a disease point of view. Cereals, oats and rye, again, these are really good at providing in the season and can be quite deep rooting. But then again, we need to think about, certainly if we're growing a straight cereal cover crop, potential conflict if we're following it with spring barley. And then legumes, clover and vetch, these need to be established a little bit earlier to get going. They're obviously nitrogen fixing. Only fixing nitrogen though when temperatures are above about 5 degrees C, so needing to get going early, and they've got a really good fibrous root system for improving that topsoil quality. But again, rotational conflict with peas and beans. And then the others which don't have the rotational conflicts, like Phacelia, Phacelia in particular is really good at rooting to depth and good at taking up nutrients, scavenging nutrients. So obviously those are sort of the cover crop choices you might have, but when we are thinking about how we destroy the cover crop, and particularly if we're going to destroy it with sheep, okay, you can just click through. basically, there's some other considerations we need to think about. So not only what it's going to do to the subsequent crop and to soils, but how much dry matter does it produce? What is the nutritional quality of that? And is it palatable? So those are some of the things we might want to be thinking about going forward in this field lab. So if we then click onto the next slide, as you're aware,
direct the microphone.
When it comes to cover cropping, and getting them in early,
Farming is business with the pound signs.
Really key if they're going to be a benefit. These two pictures are from the maxi cover crop work that we did, where we had a number of different sites and different soil types. But just to show that oats drilled in September on a light soil don't do as well.
What we really wanted to do is
Just on a medium soil. So less than half a tonne, 15 kilos of nitrogen taken up, 2 tonnes with the earlier drilled. And so the table that I've got there just sort of shows the kind of numbers, the kind of biomass production that we can get depending on the soil type, depending on when we drill. So anything up to 90 kilos of N, particularly where we've got legumes in the cover crop, is less than half a kilo of nitrogen taken up if it's drilled late and doesn't get away very well. But what we're not very certain of is when that nitrogen
design. So, you know, we've got
kilograms taken up by the cover crop. When is that released? Is it available
in cover crops?
Does it come out later on, perhaps in the following winter, or even to the subsequent crops in the rotation? And that is that
idea of commitment from people and who
we currently haven't really got a full handle on. But I've also put this comment on that says that we really need to think about when we destroy our cover crops, particularly so on clay soils. Destroying them early is key. So get them in early and destroy.
Just trying to remember on my notes.
A large cover crop biomass on a clay soil can actually hold moisture in that topsoil and cause real problems for establishing the spring cash crop. And I suppose the timing of destruction is really also key if we're thinking about how we're destroying it, if we're going to use sheep, and the time scale between destruction date and establishment of the spring crop is again something that we need to really be getting a better handle on. Next slide, please. So impacts on the cash crop yields. Evidence of really good benefits, good yield increases, and then other cases where we don't see any change. So this is just a couple of examples, again from the maxi cover crop experiment. Again, working with farmers on these tramline trials, you can see on the right a yield map picture where we've basically analysed that yield map. In fact, it was the farmer down in Kent where I showed the penetration resistance, where we had 3 different replicate strips of each treatment, and we would be able to analyse that map and come up to look and see basically if there were significant effects of the cover crop. So in the case of that Kent farmer, he saw a marginal increase in his crop yields, 0.1, 0.4, but it wasn't. We didn't think it was statistically significant when we analysed it. The farmer up in Yorkshire had a bean crop, and this was the heavy clay soil that we had problems with moisture content, and we actually saw a decrease where we had the cover crop in yields. And then in Huntingdon, we saw no change. So you can see that you get variable effects on yields, and it really does need to be a long-term investment, something that you're going to repeat on a rotational basis to build up that beneficial effect. So if we click onto the next slide, this is just an example of a cost benefit. It's particularly not very positive cost benefit, and I would say that it's not all as bleak as this, but this is what we found in the maxi cover crop. So this is basically cover crop, different cover crop types, followed by a spring barley cash crop or a spring bean cash crop, and then following it through into the winter crop. So we basically got calculated a cumulative margin over 2 years. So we've just got it for 2 different soil types, and you can see that on the whole the arrows go down. So that's just 1 year of cover cropping. So over the 20 comparisons that we had, 19 of them showed a reduction in margin, anywhere between -15 to minus almost £500 per hectare. And the one site, the one occasion where we did, was a oil radish cover crop that established well on a clay loam in Nottinghamshire. So I put a sort of comment there that actually, do we need some incentives to grow the cover crops to basically pay for the other benefits that we're getting? So there are a lot of schemes, payment for ecosystem service schemes, the elm schemes, no doubt cover crops are going to appear in that. But obviously, if we can graze the cover crop, then there's an opportunity to claw back, in some respects, some of the money that we might have potentially lost, certainly in the early years of cover cropping. So next slide, please. So just as I'm coming along to the end of my session, I just want to think and focus our minds on cover crop destruction, as that's what we're all about tonight. So glyphosate is by far the most common destruction method. All the surveys that have been done seem to suggest that. But as I said already, does destruction by sheep provide an alternative, an attractive and viable alternative? And that's really what we want to try and understand in this field lab. So again, from your responses to the initial registration, of those that use have cover crops, whether they graze them or not. So we've got basically most of you, which is great, are using some form of grazing to destroy your cover crop. But I would ask the question, do you still have to use glyphosate when you're grazing cover crops? So if we then click on to Emily, have you got a question now?
Oh, sorry, I've got a lot of feedback. Let me see if I can get this right. Anne, I'm just going to pop you on mute, see if it helps. Sorry. I just wanted to potentially, if they're willing to, bring somebody into the conversation because they've been popping a few great things into the chat and just picking up on what you were saying there, Anne, about glyphosate. I wondered, we've got Joe Hodgson on the call. Joe, if you're willing to, are you happy to switch your video on and your microphone and just provide a bit of commentary, because you've responded to the question about glyphosate?
Hi, yeah. About glyphosate, sorry.
Yeah.
I think in the I just responded to in the meeting chat there about the buckwheat and the frost sensitivity over winter.
Okay.
But I was actually just going to type out another question just now. I was just going to ask, do people find that cattle, because I can just see in that pie chart there, you've got a couple of people that are using cattle. Do people find that cattle poach the soil more so than sheep? Obviously, with being a larger animal, more weight, potentially if it comes wetter over winter during the grazing time.
Anne, have you got anything?
All I would say is I think there's not been much work from a research point of view. There is, I don't know whether it's on the next slide, but there was a study that was conducted in Wales for Welsh Government that looked at grazing fodder crops over winter with either sheep or cattle, and it did seem to suggest that cattle were worse.
Yeah.
I think there's some pictures. Kate, is it on the next slide? Yeah, there we go. So if you look at these pictures on this slide, I've got feedback as well, Emily. The top two, A and B, are where we've grazed with sheep, and C and D is grazed with cattle. So you can see, so different crops, one's on fodder beet, one's on kale, but you can see there's less poaching, less damage where we've got sheep grazing it rather than cattle. And from the research that has been done, as I say, I'll qualify it. There isn't a lot of research out there. It seems to suggest that where sheep have grazed it, that we've got the compaction and damage that's done is quite superficial, quite shallow, whereas it's slightly deeper with cattle. But again, there's very limited research, and so actually it would be good to get practitioners to say what their experiences are, I think. Yeah.
Great. And just before we move on, if I can invite Charlotte in, because she's popped something in the chat about using cattle and sheep. So I wonder, Charlotte, if you've got something that you could share with us, your experience.
Yeah, hi, morning, afternoon even. So what we found with sheep is that they're actually much even bite. So they cut, and as long as you look after it and mob them well, then they actually don't do much destruction at all. They cut it down to a much lower level, whereas we found with cattle, they pull out massive chunks. But also because we're growing, we have a mixed rotation of cereals and vegetables. As far as the microbiology is left within the manures, we actually find that there's significantly less E. coli, which then degrades within a few months anyway, which is much easier for us rather than having high counts that we've got to lose before we can then put in a vegetable crop.
And in terms of the role of sheep, removing the need for glyphosate, how do you find, are you able to reduce glyphosate or?
Well, we use sheep on both our conventional and organic land. So yes, we've removed the need on our organic land completely. We use sheep that we rent in. I guess we have a flying flock that we use because it's not our area of expertise at all. And again, on the conventional land, yes, we don't have to always use glyphosate. Sometimes we do, but I think that's just down to us having concerns about slugs and things like that more so. But the reason we're really keen to continue with our livestock work is because we don't want to use glyphosate going forward, and we think that the benefit to the soil and the returning of the nutrient is much better when it's been processed through the gut of the livestock.
Great, thank you. Sorry, Anne, I'll hand back over to you, unless there's any other questions that anyone wants to raise. Joe, was that a hand up? Oh, let me see if I can unmute you. Joe, I think you're on mute.
Oh.
There you go, that's it, that's better.
Yeah, I'd just like to add something to that, if that's okay. So I'm based in Lincolnshire, farmer and agronomist, and we don't have, in my particular area, we don't have a lot of livestock, but we sort of get livestock in and rent the grazing out where it does happen. And I've been in Lincolnshire with the blackgrass issue. I'd be really nervous to not use glyphosate even after a grazing. I agreed with what Charlotte said. Yeah, I thought she had some good points, but I think in conventional systems with blackgrass, you'd be quite brave to not glyphosate before a spring crop.
Great, thank you. Anne, I think we'll hand back over to you.
Yeah, sorry, I was writing notes.
No, that's all right, it's great.
Great. So this slide that we're nearly at the end of my bit. I just put some pros and cons that just looking at the literature and what has been done in terms of research on sheep grazing of cover crops, of which I hasten to add there is very little evidence out there. So all the more reason for trying to run this field lab. So obviously additional income from having the sheep there. I put increased nutrient cycling. There's some evidence that's saying actually passing the cover crop through the sheep, through the animal, improves the rate of nutrient cycling and release, makes the nutrients into more available forms than if it's just sprayed off and incorporated. I put weed control, and then on the other side, inadequate weed control, and I put improved yields and then decreased yields, because there's some studies that sort of say, yes, it's much better to graze it off, and you get really good weed control and you get improved yields. And there's other studies that actually say, well, the cover crop comes back and it's all sorts of problems going forward. I suppose if you're not using glyphosate, that could be one of the issues. But then obviously the biggest concern, I think, is the soil degradation, the erosion, the runoff, and the nutrient export that is associated with that, that soil degradation. And also, is nitrate leaching actually increased, for example, where we're grazing and not compared to if we don't graze? But also, are we exporting valuable nutrients in the animal? The research says that actually we're not. We're probably only taking away about less than 10% of the nutrients that are in the cover crop, because most of it's all excreted back out. But obviously there are issues there in terms of soil health, soil structure, that potentially could cause problems. So if we click onto the next slide. So just to end, these are what I think are the knowledge gaps that we could perhaps try and address. How effective are sheep at destroying a cover crop? Is it good for the sheep, and is it good for the soil? What are the best cover crop species to grow in that circumstance? So how does that affect our species choice? And then what happens to the nutrients in the cover crop? Is it better, as I say, to pass it through an animal or return it directly to the soil? And therefore, how then do you manage perhaps your nutrients going forward? And in particular, actually, is variability of nutrient return a problem? Obviously, where you might have dung and urine patches compared to a more even incorporation of cover crop material. And then how does this affect the subsequent cash crop in terms of the soil moisture, nutrient supply, the quality of the seed bed, that effect of compaction rooting? Some of the studies seem to suggest it is quite temporary, but do we then get some variability and impacts on our yields? And then finally, do the economics work? Does it add up? Does it help that balance book at the end of the day and improve the viability of having cover crops in the rotation?